But when I look on her and hope to tell with joy what I admire, my thoughts lie cramped in narrow scope, or in their feeble birth expire. No skilled complexity of speech, no simple phrase of tenderest fall, no likened excellence can reach her, the most excellent of all. The best half of creation's best, its heart to feel, its eyes to see, the crown and complex of the rest, its aim and its epitome. Nay, might I utter my conceit, 'twere after all a vulgar song, for she so simply, subtly sweet, my deepest rapture does her wrong. Yet it is now my chosen task to sing her worth as maiden wife, nor happier post than this I ask, to live her laureate all my life.
These are not the type of women and the types of activities that are being captured through literature, through histories.
A woman's place in ancient societies was basically silent and not to be thought of by men who had any sort of class or esteem or notoriety.
They were beginning to understand their own capacity for excellence and to recognize that there was no reason they should stay in the background.
She also was a strong proponent of women having, women's rights. She really hated how many women she felt like were either erased from history or just got the short end of the stick.
Sappho kind of created a lineage for women to say, oh no, like lesbians have been around since thousands of years, and it really validated their asexuality.
Histories are so interested in who did what when, and the who's are always big important men, that these kind of experiences tend to, or have a tendency to, fall out of the historical record.
I'm Meadbh Corbett, and in this documentary, I'll be ditching the men and taking you through the lives of the women of both classical Athens and Victorian Britain. The ideal woman submits to her husband. She confines herself to her household, and the life work she devotes herself to is the raising of her family. Working women, however, don't exactly get this luxury. Welcome to the cultural and imperial hub of the world, where Doric columns are all the rage, empire way signs are in and out of fashion, and despite Demos Kratos, democracy quite literally meaning people rule being in full swing, women don't have the right to vote. But there's a catch. Did you just land in classical Athens or 19th century Britain?
The representation and the reality, bit of tension between them, I think. Ideally, certainly, there is this expectation that is fed into, maintained, disseminated through literature that women will be confined within the oikos, that they will prioritise motherhood and wifedom.
The most important part of a woman's life in both Athenian society and Victorian Britain were to get married and continue the bloodline. Boys were preferred over girls to have as children because boys could be citizens and take part in democracy, whereas girls could just marry well. Jane Austen wrote in her book Emma, a single woman with a very narrow income must be ridiculous, disagreeable old maid, the proper sport of boys and girls. But a single woman of good fortune is always respectable, and may be as sensible and pleasant as anybody else. But even the ideal woman must pass her time somehow. We see this with Penelope in the Odyssey, weaving her way through 20 years without her husband. Even Athena is the goddess of weaving. We see here that these women have a basket of wool, a typical depiction of femininity perhaps, a task expected of them.
But the reality, though, I think was different, as always, especially in terms of class. Women worked outside the home in classical Athens in certain classes. Women had opportunities to take charge in religious festivals. There were opportunities for women to mix outside of the home in women-only religious rituals. They provide opportunities and legitimate opportunities to do things out in public. And there are always ways, I suppose, when you're given that legitimate public role to turn it to your advantage and make the most of that space you've been given. And people have been doing that forever, so why would we think that ancient Athenian women wouldn't do it as well?
But women breaking the mould certainly never stopped at classical Athens. In fact, it was the very study of that time period that gave the 19th century woman a new way to rebel.
So classics has always, still is today a little bit, but not to the same degree, it's always been a marker of the elite. So when women educate themselves in the classics or become familiar with the classics, that showed that they were intellectually equal to men, because there'd been so much in history of men saying women just couldn't do things because they weren't as intelligent, their brains didn't work in the same way, things like that. By becoming really educated in the classics without even having a formal education, they demonstrated that they were intellectually equal to men, and that allowed them the freedoms, or that started to allow them the freedoms to pursue their education further and gain further freedoms as well.
But this level of education wasn't always accessible to women. So they created a new social movement to break free from the chains and the men holding them down. The new woman.
So the way I see it is kind of the immediate predecessor of the feminist movement. It did have aims that we would call feminist, but that's not how it described itself. So the organised feminist movement, who were doing more active work, that came very soon after. But the new woman, she did seek to gain a lot more freedom than women had already had. So women were becoming more educated. They didn't necessarily want to get married. They didn't really want to have, often they didn't want to have children. A lot of the new women really just wanted to continue on with their education.
At the other end of the century, when the ancient Greek influence on fashion was far more noticeable, one of the most famous authors in the world was finding her beginning. Jane Austen is often thought as a romance writer, but I'd like to think she was far more of a satirist, poking fun at society and the expectations on women to marry. Her teenage writings can be easily forgotten next to her most famous works, such as Mansfield Park, Pride and Prejudice, or Emma, but perhaps they give us a better idea of how women of the past thought than her more polished writings later in her life.
The thing that most people think of when they say, oh yeah, Jane Austen wrote some teenage stuff, right, is her attack on history writing. She also was a strong proponent of women having, women's rights. And she really hated how many women she felt like were either erased from history or just got the short end of the stick. So instead of focusing these small vignettes for the different rulers of England on the actual rulers, she decided to talk about their wives or, the women in their lives who were wronged. Right? She was a huge fan of Mary Queen of Scots. And it's because she also was reading about Mary Queen of Scots at the time. So it seemed like anything that she was reading about that also intersected with her interests, found its way into the teenage writings. So it's just this kind of cacophony of texts. You know, it's discordant, it's chaotic, it's funny, and at times borderline tabloid. You know, she wrote about murderers, she wrote about thieves, she wrote about celebrities, she wrote about just anything she wanted to. And no one told her no.
However, women's history is not the only way that she went against the grain.
So I would say probably the most talked about novel is Mansfield Park, having most, I'd say, the highest level of queerness, and it's between Fanny Price and Mary Crawford. And a lot of that has to do with not only the way Austen wrote, you know, the language of the text, but also the way it's been transferred to the screen. And it's just opening up a door for us to think about women's relationships being more than just friends or sisters or, you know, parents. There are other ways of thinking about queerness besides sexuality. So, you know, queerness is such a big term. It really just means rejecting or resisting norms.
The fact is, we enter the century with very few avenues for women. With the advent of literacy and literacy for women, it's true that the opportunities, the idea of a profession for women is still new, but the idea that women can be professional is beginning to emerge in the century. You're watching this woman's voice beginning to emerge and be taken seriously. So not only were women gaining access, they were beginning to understand their own capacity for excellence and to excel and to recognize that there was no reason they should stay in the background.
These women laid the groundworks for some of the most influential movements of the modern era. Societal expectations around sexuality are one way in which we could see the woman pushing for the world to pay attention to them, and the classical world once again makes its way into the minds of women.
And they modelled a lot of the way that they lived their lives off of ancient Greek stuff, and obviously there was a lot of pederasty, things like that. Homosexuality was present, and so a lot of them lived that way. So think for example Oscar Wilde. Sappho for the women was a really big deal. Currently in my research I'm looking at these two women, Michael Field, who wrote together, and they wrote a whole collection of sapphic poetry, which is absolutely beautiful. They used Sappho to kind of validate their queerness, because in Victorian society male homosexuality was acknowledged but obviously frowned upon, whereas for women they didn't even want to talk about it. There were plans to enshrine it in law, and then they decided not to, because if they spoke about it then people would realise it was an option, which is bizarre. But Sappho kind of created a lineage for women to say, oh no, like lesbians have been around since thousands of years, and it validated their own sexuality.
It's undeniable that the classics still have a vice-like grip on our culture, even today, from the way we view eras of our history, our architecture, to our pop culture, such as Percy Jackson and the Olympians, musicals like Epic and Hadestown, and theatre in general. With all of the influence that classical Athens had over the long 19th century, does it still remain to this day? Annually at King's College London, students perform an ancient Greek play with some modernisation intermingled with the original classical text. This year, the chosen play was The Clouds by Aristophanes. The comedy satirises Athenian intellectualism and the sophists through core themes such as traditional values versus intellectual thought, education and ethics, and the central father-son relationship.
Well, this time round, I adapted The Clouds in a very wildly different way from the original.
And each has a book and notes to find points. Their natural endowments are masterful too, and now sharpened up. So I'm no fear, but tackle it all. Rescue resting assured that the spectators are safe.
But one of the main differences from the original play is that one of the main characters, Philippides, is now a Philippidis. So we changed his gender to female because, well, part of me didn't want to do a play that was only male characters, and The Clouds is a heavily male dominated really play. But it wasn't just because of that. That was just one of the reasons for me thinking through it. It was one of the earlier decisions that I made, actually. And I wanted to explore the relationship between a father and a daughter, because it is a political play, and I have turned it into like a very modern commentary on the current lovely political situation in the world at the moment. And so what I decided to do was to explore the political elements of the play through the eyes of both genders, really.
Oh, it's so nice to work.
I think that gave me the span to build a character arc that I thought was going to be much more powerful. Not inherently because she's a woman, because it's not exactly where I wanted to go, but it's more about trying to explore how a woman trying to reclaim her space in ancient Greece would have looked like.
I think that Giulia's choice to prioritize a conversation about women in educational settings, about how women can and cannot access pedagogy as class leveling tool, I think is incredibly wise. And while these students aren't studying drama, they're studying classics, they're given the opportunity in this play to question the intersections of performance as correlate to not only their pedagogical work, their educational backgrounds, but also their everyday life, so their interactions with the world around them and how the world perceives them.
And I think this is the beauty of the ancient Western Mediterranean, is that so many of the conversations that are at the centre of our world today, conversations around gender, sexuality, identity, nationality, race, ethnicity, the environment, all of these find their earliest surviving expressions in those ancient texts, and so it makes sense. You know, whenever we talk about the ancient world, I think we're talking about the here and now.
Well, it feels as if we have not fully succeeded at making opportunity available to every woman. Yes, some women, especially women who start out by enjoying some kind of middle class or upper class status, do manage to move ahead. I think still coming from the lower classes, it's very easy to get trapped.
You know, what we focus on is what is it in these texts that really reach out to us as people, as family members, and, you know, as people struggling in society. I think that Austen has such a way of writing these characters that they really do, they really do span the test of time.
And also, because we're allowing ourselves to think and look more broadly, we're discovering new things, right? Like those closet plays, like plays from playwrights that we wouldn't have expected to have written as much as they did, because we're allowing ourselves to accept the fact that they were poor, or women, or people of color. We're just more accepting, and I think that it's work that must continue happening.